My mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're finally learning, like a pup, because that's what you are." She said it after I'd cleared the dinner table like a servant, while the whole family laughed. What she didn't know was that her husband's lawyer had been watching the entire scene from the corner of the room, and that moment would change everything. Before we get started, like this video, drop a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I used to believe marriage was a kind of refuge, a home you built in someone else's arms, safe from the storms of the world. At 38, I thought I'd finally found that shelter with Claire. She was beautiful, quick-witted, and carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone born into wealth. Loving her came easily. Believing she loved me just as deeply came even easier. But sometimes, love blinds you more than it protects you. It was a Tuesday night in late November when I stumbled across the truth. Her father, the patriarch of their empire, was bedridden upstairs, his lungs failing him slowly. The entire family had gathered in the mansion that week, claiming to be there to support him. But support in that house was a peculiar thing. It always came dressed as calculation, as positioning, as whispered conversations in shadowed corners. I hadn't meant to overhear them. I'd only gone down to the library because sleep wouldn't come. The old house had a way of creaking at night, like it carried the weight of its secrets in the walls. I was halfway down the staircase when I heard my name.
Alex, don't worry. Once Father passes, we'll make sure the will is amended properly. He won't get a cent he doesn't deserve.
The voice belonged to Margaret, Claire's mother. Sharp, cold, clipped like the snap of scissors. My chest tightened. An instinct told me to turn back, to retreat to the guest room and pretend I hadn't heard. But my legs carried me downward, silent step by silent step, until I stood just behind the archway. The library door was slightly ajar, enough to see shadows moving, enough to hear every word. Honestly, it was a mistake letting Claire marry him, her brother Jonathan added. A working man in this family? He doesn't belong here. Father was sentimental, that's all. Alex fooled him with his quiet manners. But when it comes to inheritance, blood should stay with blood. A murmur of agreement followed. My wife was there. I could hear her. Not a protest, not a defense, just silence. That silence cut deeper than the words. Margaret spoke again, her tone lowering.
We'll handle it discreetly. The lawyers are on our side. When Father's gone, Alex will find out exactly where he stands in this family. Nowhere.
I gripped the banister until my knuckles whitened. My heart hammered, but not from fear, from something heavier. Betrayal has a way of hollowing you out in seconds, leaving behind a cold emptiness. In that emptiness, I could hear my own thoughts echoing. So this is what they think of me. This is what she thinks of me. I stayed there, listening as they laughed softly, as they discussed me like I was a stain to be scrubbed out of their legacy. Claire never said a word, not even when her mother said, "She'll see reason." She always does. Alex is just a phase a mistake will quietly erase. My wife let it stand. In that moment, I realized I wasn't part of her family. I was their guest, their tolerated outsider, their expendable mistake. And though I walked back to our room quietly, climbed into bed beside her warmth, and let her rest her head against my chest, as if nothing had changed, something inside me shifted permanently. The weeks following that night were a study in self-control. I had heard their whispers, their plans, their certainty that once the old man was gone, I'd be nothing more than a footnote in their history. But instead of fighting, I smiled. Instead of confronting Claire, I kissed her forehead each morning, asked about her day, played the dutiful husband. If silence was the weapon she had chosen, then silence would become mine as well. It's strange how quickly people believe the mask you show them. Margaret, always watchful, began praising me again in her faintly condescending way. "Alex is finally learning," she said one evening as I helped clear the table. Jonathan smirked, adding, "Yes, like a well-trained pup." I laughed with them, laughed as if I didn't notice the insult, as if I hadn't noticed the way Claire's eyes flickered to mine, searching for a reaction. I gave her none. Inside, though, I was cataloging everything. Their words, their gestures, their habits. I became a student of their cruelty. The only person who treated me differently was Claire's father, Henry Whitmore. Henry was old money through and through, but illness had stripped him of the arrogance that seemed to run in his bloodline. Better than most days, he clung to his memories the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. While the others kept their visits brief and performative, I stayed. I sat by his bedside for hours, reading to him from his favorite history books or listening as he told me stories of his youth, nights sneaking out of prep school, the business risks he took in his 20s, the mistakes he never admitted to his children. "You remind me of myself, Alex," he said once, his voice thin but steady. "Not in birthright, but in grit. My children, they've never had to fight for anything. You have. That makes you dangerous in ways they can't imagine." Dangerous. The word echoed in me, though I never showed it. "I don't think they see me that way," I replied, keeping my tone mild. "They don't see you at all," Henry said. His hand, frail and veined, tapped the armrest. "And that's why you'll outlast them." I studied him then, wondering if he already knew what I had overheard. If he, too, had seen through their plotting. His eyes glittered with something I couldn't place. Approval, maybe, or relief. During those weeks, while I played the perfect son-in-law, I began noticing things about the family business. The Whitmores weren't as untouchable as they liked to pretend. Jonathan bragged constantly about his investments, but I could tell from the numbers he dropped that they were hemorrhaging money. Margaret spent lavishly on appearances, yet I overheard her whispering to a banker about extending lines of credit. Claire's younger sister, Eloise, kept arriving late to family dinners, smelling of gin, her purse always stuffed with casino vouchers. They were fractured. They just didn't know it yet. Henry did, though. I could see it in the quiet way he shook his head when Jonathan boasted, or when Margaret spun tales about their stability. He knew his empire was rotting beneath the surface. And sometimes, when the others left the room, he'd turn to me and say, "They'll destroy everything I built, Alex. They don't understand money. They don't respect it. But you," he coughed, sharp and rattling, "you're the only one I've seen who values it the way I did." I said nothing, just sat there, holding a glass of water for him, watching him sip slowly, watching the thought linger on his face. All the while, my marriage continued as though nothing had changed. Claire was affectionate in her way, gentle touches, soft words, the life of comfort we shared. Yet when I looked at her now, I couldn't stop hearing her silence that night in the library. Sometimes I wanted to ask her, "Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you defend me?" But every time the words rose to my lips, I swallowed them. Instead, I studied her, the way she leaned into her mother's approval, the way she avoided conflict like it was fire. I realized she was raised to be silent, to obey. And in that silence, she'd sacrificed me. I couldn't forgive that. Not yet. And so, piece by piece, I shed my old skin. I was no longer the man trying to fit into their family. No longer the outsider hoping for acceptance. I was something else now, an actor on their stage, playing the fool while rehearsing for the moment I'd take center. When Jonathan mocked my career, I chuckled and raised a toast. When Margaret belittled my modest upbringing, I nodded graciously and poured her more wine. When Claire looked at me with those quiet, questioning eyes, I kissed her hand and said, "Everything's fine, darling." But inside, the storm grew louder. I wasn't going to beg for a place in their world anymore. I was going to take it, and when I did, they would never see it coming. And finally, the moment came in grand style. The whole reading ended in chaos. Jonathan stormed out first, muttering curses under his breath, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles looked ready to burst through skin. Eloise laughed a little too loudly, the kind of brittle laughter that came from disbelief. Margaret stayed seated, rigid and silent, her eyes fixed on me with the cold intensity of a predator rethinking its hunt. Claire lingered. She didn't move, didn't speak. When she finally looked at me, her face was pale, her lips parted, but no words came. I didn't offer her any. That night, the storm outside had quieted, but inside the Whitmore mansion it raged on. I had just closed the door to the study when Margaret appeared in the doorway, her pearls catching the dim light. "You manipulated him," she said, her voice low, venomous. No. Rupa. Gaon. I respected him. She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the wood floor. Do you really think you'll hold on to this? Jonathan will contest it. The courts will tear this apart. I met her stare evenly. It's airtight. You know it. Henry made sure. Her jaw tightened, the faintest crack in her composure. You'll ruin this family. I let the silence stretch between us before answering. No, Margaret. You already did. I just inherited the ashes. Her nostrils flared, but she said nothing more. She turned sharply and left, her perfume trailing behind her like smoke. The next morning, Jonathan cornered me in the hallway. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie askew. He reeked of whiskey. You think you've won, don't you? He snarled, jabbing a finger into my chest. This isn't over. I'll bury you in court. You'll lose everything. And when you do, don't expect Claire to stand by you. I caught his finger before he jabbed me again, squeezing it just hard enough to make him flinch. Try me, I said softly. But remember, you've never fought for anything in your life. I have, and men like me don't lose. I let go, and he stumbled back, glaring, but I could see the crack of uncertainty in his eyes. Later that day, Eloise slipped into the study where I was reviewing some of Henry's papers. Her eyes were bloodshot, her makeup smeared. You don't want this burden, Alex, she said, slumping into the chair across from me. The company, the estate, it'll eat you alive. Give me my share, let me walk away, and I'll back you when the others come for you. I closed the folder in front of me and studied her. And what would you do with it, Eloise? Gamble it away? Pour it into another bottle? Her face flushed with anger, then shame. She looked away, muttering, You're no better than them. Pretending you're above it all, but you're just another vulture. I leaned forward. No, I'm the man your father trusted when he couldn't trust any of you. Remember that the next time you try to bargain with me. She left in silence, her shoulders hunched. That night, in our room, I waited for Claire to speak. To say something, to tell me she was proud, or afraid, or conflicted. Anything but silence. Instead, she undressed quietly, slid into bed beside me, and turned away, facing the wall. I stared at her back in the dim light, the outline of her shoulder, the curve of her neck. 1,000 words pressed against my lips, but none escaped. Because I already knew the answer, she would never choose me over them. Not really. Her silence was louder than any declaration. The days that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, formal transfers, and hushed phone calls. Jonathan raged. Margaret plotted. Eloise drank. Claire drifted like a ghost between us. And me? I played my role. Calm, polite, agreeable. The perfect son-in-law still. But beneath the mask, I was no longer just observing. I was preparing, because now the pieces were on the board, and the game had finally begun. Power doesn't change a man. It reveals him. When Henry's will placed everything in my hands, the Whitmores thought I'd crumble under the weight. They thought I'd be clumsy, overwhelmed, desperate to lean on them for guidance. They mistook silence for weakness. They forgot silence can also mean calculation. Jonathan was the easiest to deal with because he was reckless. He'd been siphoning money from the company for years, disguising it as consulting fees through shell accounts. I found the trail within a week of gaining access to the ledgers. Henry had left me notes, margin scribbles, circled figures, like breadcrumbs waiting to be followed. I didn't confront Jonathan directly. No, I let him walk into the trap himself. At the next board meeting, he swaggered in, smirking at me from across the table. He spoke loudly, boasting about his vision for expanding into Europe. The other board members nodded, not out of respect, but out of habit. When it was my turn to speak, I slid a folder across the polished table. Before we discuss expansion, perhaps we should review the irregularities in our financial records. Jonathan's smile faltered as the documents spread before him. Proof of his theft, every transfer, every shell account laid bare. The room turned on him in seconds. Questions flew. Accusations. He sputtered, denied, tried to laugh it off as accounting errors. But numbers don't lie, and neither did Henry's handwriting in the margins. Jonathan cannot be trusted. By the end of the meeting, Jonathan was stripped of his title, his authority dissolved. He left the room shaking with rage, his pride bleeding out on the marble floor. I didn't stop him. I didn't have to. He was already broken. Eloise was different. She wasn't cruel like Margaret or arrogant like Jonathan. She was weak, and weakness is its own kind of poison. I didn't expose her. I didn't need to. Instead, I tightened the leash. I froze her allowance, citing fiduciary responsibility. When she stormed into my office, mascara streaking down her cheeks, demanding money, I handed her a check for a fraction of what she wanted. Enough for rent, enough for food, I said evenly. Nothing more until you can prove you're not gambling it away. Her hand shook as she clutched the check. You can't do this to me. I'm family. I leaned forward. So am I. At least, your father thought so. The words crushed her more than the restriction. She left in tears, muttering that I was cruel. But cruelty wasn't the goal. Dependence was. And now, Eloise was bound to me tighter than any chain. Margaret was the true queen of the Whitmore court. Cold, calculating, relentless. Breaking her required patience. I began by dismantling her influence piece by piece. Her charities? I redirected funds away from her pet projects and into causes Henry had quietly supported, places she couldn't touch. Her social circle? I invited her closest allies to private dinners, where I spoke of honoring Henry's legacy. They nodded, smiled, and one by one began aligning themselves with me. When she realized what I was doing, she confronted me in the same study where Henry had once ruled. You're clever, Alex, she said, her voice icy. I'll give you that, but you're playing with wolves. And wolves eat sheep like you. I met her gaze calm, steady. Funny, because from where I'm standing, it looks like the wolf pack just lost its teeth. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret Whitmore looked uncertain. And then there was Claire, my wife. She was no thief, no schemer, no manipulator. She was simply silent, always silent. In the evenings, she'd watch me across the dinner table, her fork resting untouched against her plate. Sometimes she'd start to speak, then stop. Her eyes carried questions, but her lips never shaped them. One night, I finally asked, why didn't you defend me in the library, Claire? Her fork slipped, clattering softly. She didn't answer at first. Then she whispered, because speaking against them would have meant losing them. And I was afraid of that. I stared at her, feeling the weight of every quiet moment, every silence she'd chosen over me. And what about losing me? I asked. Her eyes dropped. She had no answer. That was her betrayal. Not words, but the absence of them. And it was harder to forgive than any insult Margaret or Jonathan had ever thrown. By the end of that first month, the Whitmores were no longer the towering figures they once were. Jonathan was disgraced, Eloise was dependent, Margaret was cornered, and Claire was still silent. And me? I was no longer the outsider. I was the empire. Henry had been right. They didn't see me at all, and that blindness had been their undoing. But my revenge wasn't finished. Not yet, because taking their power was one thing. Making them live with the humiliation of their downfall, that was the real game. And I was only just beginning to play. Revenge is a drug. At first it tastes sharp, intoxicating, cleansing. But the longer you drink from it, the harder it becomes to stop. I stood at the center of everything Henry had left behind. His empire, his estate, his legacy. And yet I felt no peace. The Whitmores were shadows now. Their power shattered, their pride gutted. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something else gnawing at me. The question of how far I would go. Because revenge doesn't end when you win. It ends when you decide to stop. Jonathan had become a ghost of himself. Once the golden boy of the Whitmore name, he now stumbled through the city in half-wrinkled suits, his voice hoarse from shouting in courtrooms he couldn't win. One evening, he came to my office, unshaven, reeking of cheap whiskey. His hands trembled as he leaned across my desk. You've taken everything, he rasped. The house. The company. The respect. What do you want from me now? To beg. I studied him, silent. Fine, he spat, sinking to his knees on the polished floor. I am begging. Give me something. Anything. I'm your brother-in-law. The sight of Jonathan Whitmore kneeling before me should have been sweet. Years ago, he'd once called me a charity project in a suit. Now here he was broken, desperate. And yet, instead of triumph, I felt something colder, pity. I slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a check, enough to keep him alive, not enough to restore his pride. "Stand up, Jonathan," I said evenly. "You've already lost. Don't lose what little you have left." He took the envelope, his eyes hollow, and staggered out without another word. Eloise's decline was quieter, but no less tragic. Her laughter had turned brittle, her hands always trembling. Without her endless allowance, she was exposed, stripped of the friends who had only ever circled her for scraps of her wealth. She came to me one morning, her eyes red, clutching a half-crumpled letter. "It's rehab," she whispered. "They won't take me unless I can pay. Please, Alex, please help me." I could have her fused. God knows she had sneered at me enough times, called me the accountant who thought he was family. But when I looked at her, I didn't see Eloise the enemy. I saw Eloise the addict, the broken girl who had been raised to drown her pain in money. I signed the check. Her hand brushed mine as she took it, her eyes wet. "Why are you helping me? After everything?" I looked at her steadily. "Because your father asked me to do better than him. Maybe this is what he meant." She sobbed softly and left. And for the first time since I'd known her, Eloise Whitmore didn't look at me with contempt. Margaret was the hardest. She had been the architect of my humiliation, the silent executioner of my dignity, the matriarch who had decided I was unworthy of her bloodline. Taking her power had been easy. Taking her pride was harder. When I finally confronted her, she sat in the Whitmore study, the same chair where Henry had once dictated the fate of empires. She looked smaller now, her pearls dull in the lamplight. "You've won," she said flatly. "Is that what you came to hear?" "No, Olivia. I came to hear the truth." Her eyes narrowed. "And what truth would that be? That you knew I loved Claire. That you knew I wanted nothing from this family but respect. And you decided that wasn't enough." For the first time, Margaret's mask cracked. Her lips trembled. Her eyes glistened. "You weren't one of us," she whispered. "And I couldn't let Henry forget that. He always saw you as the son he wished he'd had. Do you know what that does to a wife? To a mother?" The confession landed heavier than I expected. She hadn't hated me because I was weak. She'd hated me because Henry had loved me in a way he never loved her. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Then your war was never with me, Margaret. It was with your husband." She flinched. I left her in silence, her empire in ashes around her. And then there was Claire. One night, long after the others had scattered into their ruins, she came to me in the bedroom. She stood by the window, her nightgown pale against the moonlight. "I know you'll never forgive me," she said softly. "Not for staying silent, not for watching them tear you down. But I need you to know, I wasn't silent because I didn't love you. I was silent because I was afraid. Afraid of losing them. Afraid of losing you." Her voice cracked. And in the end, I lost both. I watched her, my chest heavy. For years, I had loved Claire Whitmore more than my own breath. But love without loyalty is a slow death. And I was done dying. I stood, walked past her, and paused at the door. "You didn't lose me, Claire," I said quietly. "You gave me away." I left her standing in the moonlight, her silence echoing louder than any scream. By the end of it, the Whitmores were finished. Their empire was mine, their power dissolved, their pride in pieces. I had the final word. I could have destroyed them completely, thrown Jonathan into prison, left Eloise in the gutter, forced Margaret into public humiliation, abandoned Claire entirely. But I didn't, because I realized something Henry had tried to teach me. Revenge feels good. Mercy feels stronger. I left Jonathan his dignity in scraps. I gave Eloise a chance to heal. I let Margaret keep her pearls and her cold throne of memories. And Claire, I left her with her silence because some prisons are built without walls. And me, I walked away with everything they thought I'd never deserve. And I guess that was what gave me peace at the end of it all. If you enjoyed this story, do well to like, comment your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.